I want to start with three numbers because numbers have a way of cutting through emotion faster than headlines ever will. 35 to 850, 250 to 1900, 1050 to nearly 4800. Those were the three biggest gold moves of the modern era. Different decades, different presidents, different excuses, different media narratives. And yet, every single one of those moves was preceded by the same four signals. Not 3 out of 4, not most of the time. Not if the market feels nervous. The same four signals every time. And what has my full attention right now is that those four signals are lining up again. Not in theory, not in a classroom, not in a thought experiment. In the real world with real debt, real policy, real central bank behavior, and real damage already showing up in cash savings and bond math. When I was younger, I could afford to believe that the monetary system was more disciplined than it really was. I could afford to think governments would eventually do the hard thing, cut spending, accept pain, tell voters the truth. I do not believe that anymore. I have watched too many cycles. I have watched too many governments discover that debasing money is politically easier than admitting insolvency. And once you understand that, you stop asking the wrong question. The wrong question is whether gold is suddenly magical. The right question is whether the people running the system have crossed the point where honest repayment is no longer possible. That is where gold starts mattering. So let me walk you through the four signals, exactly the way I would want someone to explain them to me if I had to protect serious money under a bad monetary regime. The first signal is not simply that debt is large. Debt is always large. Governments can survive with large debt for a very long time. The first signal is that debt crosses the point where repayment becomes politically impossible and mathematically absurd. That is a different thing. A country can handle debt when growth can plausibly outrun it, when taxation can plausibly service it, and when spending can plausibly be cut if pressure rises. But once you reach the stage where all three of those doors are effectively closed, you are no longer dealing with a fiscal problem. You are dealing with a monetary outcome waiting for a political excuse. That is what people miss. They look at debt the way they look at a headline. I look at debt the way a lender should look at a borrower. Can this borrower realistically pay me back in money with the same purchasing power I lent him? If the answer is no, then the game shifts. Now let us prove that with history. In the 1930s, the United States had already strained itself through the aftershocks of World War I and then the Great Depression. The debt and banking strain were not problems you could solve with cheerful speeches. So the government did what governments do when they cannot tolerate the consequence of honesty. It changed the monetary rules. It took gold ownership out of private hands and then revalued gold upward from $20 to $35. In plain English, it diluted the measuring stick after taking control of it. If you held dollars and trusted the system, you were poorer. If you understood that the state had reached the point where it had to move the definition of money itself, you understood why gold repriced. Fast forward to the late 1960s and early 1970s. America was writing promises faster than its gold backing and monetary discipline could support. War spending, domestic spending, too many claims chasing too little restraint. Foreign governments understood this before the average citizen did. They began asking for gold instead of taking more paper promises. Nixon's answer was not repayment. It was rule change. Temporary, they said governments love that word temporary, is the most permanent word in politics. The gold window closed. The dollar was cut loose. Gold then moved from 35 to 850. People loved to talk about that move as though it was some mysterious speculative mania. It was not mysterious. It was the monetary verdict on a government that had crossed the line from discipline to expedience. Then you moved to the 2000s after the dot-com bust, after war spending, after the credit bubble, after the banking crisis. The debt machine had to be protected again. Nobody in charge was going to permit the full liquidation of the system. So they invented a prettier phrase for the old habit, quantitative easing. That sounds sophisticated. It sounds surgical. It sounds modern. But underneath the costume, it was the same old confession. The system could not bear honest pricing of debt and credit. So new money had to be manufactured to absorb the old mistakes. Gold moved from around 250 to around 1900. Again, not because gold became smarter, because the currency regime became more desperate. And now look at where we are. The national debt is running toward $40 trillion. On a household basis, the scale is grotesque. The ratio to ordinary earning power is not remotely sane. There is no realistic path where this debt is honestly paid down in money of stable purchasing power. There is only rollover, dilution, repression, and political theater designed to keep the public from using the correct language. So first rule, when debt reaches the point where repayment has to be replaced with debasement, gold begins to matter. Second rule, governments do not announce monetary failure by saying, "We have failed." They announce it by changing the rules. That is the second signal. This is where amateurs get fooled and institutions get rich. The public thinks monetary breakdown looks like chaos. It often looks like bureaucracy, a legal tweak, a Sunday announcement, an emergency measure, a new facility, a revised framework, some new instrument that improves market function. The wording changes, the substance does not. The state rewrites the game so it can survive the consequences of the game it already broke. Franklin Roosevelt did it directly. Gold ownership restrictions revaluation. That was not subtle. Nixon did it on television. He did not say, "We printed too much and cannot honor the old promise." He said he was suspending convertibility. Same outcome, cleaner language. After 2008, they did it through central banking vocabulary. They did not call it money creation to rescue an over-leveraged system. They called it asset purchases, facilities support, stabilization. But the point was identical. Change the architecture fast enough that nominal stability survives, even if real purchasing power does not. And today the rule changes are back again, only this time they are more fragmented, more technical, and easier for the average person to ignore. You see it in the way governments are trying to manufacture demand for sovereign debt through new channels. You see it in the way the financial system is being nudged, so more balance sheet capacity is captured for state financing. You see it in the way policymakers are willing to tolerate inflation while cutting or easing sooner than the textbooks would once have justified. You see it in the way stablecoin regulation and treasury demand are being linked so that a new digital wrapper can be used to support an old debt problem. The details may bore people. The mechanism should terrify them. When rule changes show up, they are not random, they are admissions. They are the fingerprints left by a system that can no longer function under the old constraints. That is why I pay less attention to official explanations and more attention to the direction of the rule change. Does it increase monetary discipline, or does it create a new path to absorb debt? Suppress yields or keep the machine running one more year? If the answer is the second one, then I know exactly which era we are in, and that leads to signal number 3. The signal ordinary savers finally feel in their bones. Your savings account starts making you poorer, not on paper. On paper, the balance still rises. That is what tricks people. They think a number going up means wealth is being preserved. It does not. If your bank pays you 2%, 3%, even 4%, but the real cost of living rises 6%, 7%, or more in the categories that actually matter to you, then your money is decaying in real time while pretending to behave. That is not safety. That is anesthetized loss. This is where I have the least patience for conventional financial comfort talk. A lot of otherwise intelligent people still believe cash is prudent, simply because it does not fluctuate every day on a screen. They confuse visible volatility with actual risk. I do not. If I lose purchasing power slowly, predictably, legally, and continuously, that is still a loss. After Nixon closed the gold window, inflation ripped higher. Savings instruments did not keep up. Bondholders learned the ugly truth about fixed income under a regime that is no longer fixed in anything honest. Your coupon can stay the same while your life becomes dramatically more expensive. After 2008, the pattern changed form, but not essence. Rates were crushed toward zero. Safe money became guaranteed stagnation. If you were a disciplined saver, the system effectively told you that prudence deserved punishment. Meanwhile, Real assets and financial assets closest to newly created liquidity levitated. That is not an accident. That is how the transfer works. The saver thinks he is being cautious. The system sees him as the raw material, and today the same structure is back. Even where nominal rates look better than they did a few years ago, they still fail the only test that matters. Do they preserve purchasing power after tax, after inflation, and after the real cost increases that dominate adult life? Food insurance, utilities, rent, healthcare, maintenance, education. If the answer is no, then your savings are not defending you. They are quietly financing the transfer from people who hold currency to people who hold assets. That is the third signal, when savers realize they are not earning a return but bleeding purchasing power in slow motion. They begin searching for exits. And then the fourth signal appears. The people who print money begin buying the thing they cannot print. That is signal 4. Central banks buy gold. To me, this is the cleanest tell in the entire system, because it strips away the excuses. You can listen to a politician explain inflation. You can listen to a central banker explain temporary pressures. You can listen to economists debate whether current policy is slightly restrictive or slightly accommodative. But if the institutions closest to fiat power are accumulating gold, I pay attention. Before 1971, foreign governments and central banks were already losing confidence in the dollar's relationship to gold. They moved before the public understood the significance. They did not need a social media thread to tell them what was happening. They understood incentives. They understood arithmetic. They understood that if America had promised more than it could honor, then paper claims were less attractive than metal. After the 2008 crisis, central banks shifted again. For years, many of them had been complacent sellers or passive holders. Then they flipped. They started buying emerging markets, especially began increasing gold reserves as a hedge against the moral and monetary direction of the developed world. And now that buying has become one of the defining structural features of this era. 15 straight years of central bank buying. Nearly 1,000 tons in a single recent year. China, India, Poland, Turkey, Kazakhstan, the Czech Republic, and more. That is not retail enthusiasm. That is institutional mistrust expressed through reserve allocation. It is a no confidence vote cast quietly by the very entities that understand sovereign balance sheets better than television commentators ever will. So line up the 4 signals and the picture becomes very hard to ignore. First signal, debt reaches the point where honest repayment is no longer realistic. Second signal, the rules change so the state can survive the consequences of the debt it cannot honestly repay. Third signal, cash and bonds stop preserving real purchasing power for ordinary savers. Fourth signal, central banks and serious monetary actors begin accumulating gold. That sequence is not random. That is the precondition set before gold's biggest repricings. And I think too many people make a serious mistake right here. They hear this kind of argument and immediately swing to one of 2 extremes. The first extreme is denial. They say gold is barbarous, outdated, unproductive, emotional, political, or boring. The second extreme is zealotry. They decide gold is the only answer, the only asset, the only truth, the whole portfolio, the whole religion, the whole future. I reject both reactions. I do not need to worship gold to respect the message it sends. And I certainly do not need to abandon every other productive asset to understand when the monetary backdrop is turning hostile to cash. So here's how I think about it. Gold is not the get-rich-quick trade. It is not a meme stock. It is not a lottery ticket. It is not the kind of asset you buy because you want fireworks by next Friday. Gold is what you buy when you think the measuring stick itself is being shaved. That is a different purpose. And because its purpose is different, its position size should be handled with adult discipline. I still believe productive businesses matter enormously. I still believe stocks deserve the largest share of most serious portfolios over long periods, especially when bought rationally and owned patiently. I still believe real estate, when priced correctly and financed correctly, can preserve and compound wealth. I still believe diversification is not glamorous, but glamour is where a lot of money goes to die. So I do not think in absolutes. I think in layers. If I already know the state is likely to choose debasement over discipline, then I want some exposure to the assets that historically respond best to that choice. That means I can justify meaningful exposure to precious metals, not as a confession of despair, but as a recognition of incentives. What would I not do? I would not go all in. I would not confuse conviction with recklessness. I would not ignore the fact that gold can be violently volatile, even inside a major bull market. People forget this because they only remember the destination. They do not remember the path. In the middle of the great 1970s gold bull market, gold suffered savage drawdowns, deep ones, long ones, enough to shake out anyone who confused a long trend with a straight line. That matters. Because if you size the position badly, even a correct thesis can still beat you to death before it pays you. That is why risk management matters more than passion. Position size matters more than slogans. Staying solvent matters more than sounding prophetic. Now let me talk plainly about the routes a normal investor could think about. One route is simple exposure through a liquid gold vehicle. Easy to buy, easy to hold, easy to size. Good for people who want exposure without dealing with storage or insurance or transport or the practical reality of handling physical metal. Another route is physical ownership that has advantages of its own, especially for people who value direct possession and distrust intermediated structures. But it also comes with practical burdens and, depending on jurisdiction, tax considerations and storage questions that should not be treated casually. A third route is the one that tempts people most during a true gold bull market: miners. Miners are not gold. Miners are businesses connected to gold, and that difference is the entire game. A miner can outperform gold dramatically because its cost base is partly fixed while the price of its output rises. If gold rises 25% and the production cost does not rise nearly as much, margins can expand much faster than the gold price itself. That is where the torque comes from. But torque cuts both ways: operational problems, cost overruns, jurisdiction risk, management stupidity, financing mistakes, and market stress can turn a beautiful commodity thesis into a lousy equity outcome. So I would never treat miners as a substitute for understanding risk. They are a higher volatility expression of the same macro idea. Nothing more, nothing less. If I were trying to summarize the entire situation in one sentence, it would be this: gold tends to explode not when people suddenly become irrational, but when governments become trapped. That is the heart of it. They accumulate too much debt. They refuse the pain of honest adjustment. They change the rules. They destroy the real return on cash, and the institutions closest to money itself start moving toward metal. That is the pattern. And I believe we are much further into that pattern than most people are prepared to admit. I do not know the exact path from here. I do not pretend to know the precise timing. I do not know whether the move will be smooth or jagged, interrupted or violent. I do not know what quarter the public fully wakes up. I do not know which policy headline will finally make ordinary savers understand that the system was never trying to preserve their purchasing power in the first place. But I do know this: when all four signals flash together, history has not been subtle. And the people who waited for total emotional comfort before acting usually ended up buying much later, much higher. And with far more fear, I would rather be early with discipline than late with regret. I would rather own some insurance before the house smells like smoke. I would rather respect the arithmetic of governments than trust their vocabulary. And above all, I would rather judge the system by what its most informed actors are doing, not by what its loudest defenders are saying. When debt cannot be repaid honestly, money gets politicized. When money gets politicized, rules get rewritten. When rules get rewritten, cash gets sacrificed. When cash gets sacrificed, gold gets rediscovered. That sequence has happened before. It is happening again. And whether you decide to act on it or not, you should at least have the decency to yourself to see it clearly before the rest of the crowd calls it obvious. Now, there is one more point I want to leave you with, because this is where people sabotage themselves. Even after seeing the pattern correctly, they continue holding the wrong side of the regime because the wrong side feels familiar. Long duration bonds feel respectable. Large cash balances feel prudent. Fixed promises from institutions feel orderly. But if the environment is shifting toward repression, debasement, and managed inflation, then familiarity becomes a trap. A long bond is a bet that future money will retain enough integrity to make a fixed coupon meaningful. A large idle cash balance is a bet that patience will be rewarded more than ownership. Under a healthy monetary regime, those bets can make sense, under a regime flashing the same four signals that preceded gold. As biggest repricings, those bets become much harder to defend. That does not mean every bond is foolish. That does not mean every cash reserve is idiotic. You still need liquidity. You still need optionality. You still need the ability to meet obligations without becoming a forced seller. But I would not confuse a necessary cash reserve with a serious, long-term wealth strategy. And I would not mistake nominal safety for real safety. That distinction becomes everything when governments are trying to preserve the appearance of stability while quietly changing who absorbs the cost. If I were structuring a serious portfolio in this kind of environment, I would ask four blunt questions. First, how much of my net worth depends on the purchasing power of currency remaining stable? Second, how much of my portfolio earns fixed returns in a system that is incentivized to erode fixed returns? Third, how much do I own that represents productive, scarce, or hard to replicate value? Fourth, if policymakers choose the politically easy route again, which they almost always do, am I positioned to survive that choice or merely complain about it? Those questions are more valuable than predictions, because predictions flatter the ego positioning, protects the family. The reason I take this seriously is not because I expect civilization to end. Quite the opposite. I expect the system to do what it has always done when trapped. It will adapt in the ugliest convenient way available. It will preserve itself first. It will tax invisibly where possible. It will dilute before it defaults. It will punish passivity more than it punishes leverage. It will reward those who understand the new rules before the public realizes the rules changed. And that is exactly why gold matters at these moments. Not because it builds railroads, not because it writes software, not because it compounds the way a great business compounds, but because in periods when the state starts tampering with the ruler itself, the one thing people rediscover is the value of owning something outside the ruler. I have spent enough time around capital to know that the biggest mistakes are usually made by people who insist the world should behave the way it used to. I do not invest based on should. I invest based on incentives, behavior, arithmetic, and history. And right now, history is not whispering. It is practically shouting, debt beyond repayment, rules being rewritten. Real returns on savings, turning negative, central banks, buying gold. That is not noise. That is the setup. And setups like this have a habit of making very patient people look very smart a few years later.